Hey everyone, today we're ranking all of the Dead by Daylight killers' base lore or backstories from worst to best. We're not going to include the tomes, because most of the characters don't have them yet. I'll possibly do a separate video focusing on those who do have tome entries later on. Keep in mind for this lore, I'm not going to be going over the specific details of each piece, because that would take forever. This is going to be more of a brief summary. If you haven't read the lore yourself, I'm going to put up suggestions for if I think you should read it, and also my favourite quote from each of the characters' base lore. To rank the base lore, we're going to put them into one of 5 categories. The first is pointless, then dull, fine, good, and finally, great. As always, this is just my opinion. Be sure to drop yours down below. Let's get into it. Starting off with the pointless tier, Demogorgon is up first. Demo's lore is basically just a description of the character, or the creature, like that's it. It doesn't even really recap the events of Stranger Things, it just gives an extended description of the Demogorgon. So yeah, it literally adds nothing unless you don't really know anything about the creature, I guess. Nemesis is another description of the character, but this time with a bit of context surrounding the events of when he was taken, during the events of Resident Evil 3. I get the feeling that they could only give a general idea of the story, and not go into any detail at all really, so people would be more incentivized to play RE3. Rather pointless, but again, decent introduction to the character. Shape's lore has a similar introduction, but in a little more detail, with better descriptions I feel. It also acts almost as a prelude to Halloween, which I would argue is the better way to go. Instead of half explaining the story vaguely, it just sets up the events of Halloween, which I prefer. Still, very short and fairly pointless. Cenobite's lore I think may be the shortest lore in the game. Despite this, it does provide a cool little breakdown of his arrival into the realm. It doesn't recap or go into unnecessary detail on his visual look, which I like too. It just gives an intro to why he's here. It's apt, but still quite pointless. Executioner's lore is a little bit longer than some of these recaps, as it at least tries to explain away the somewhat strange reason for him appearing in the realm to begin with. I'm pretty sure canonically, Pyramid Head is dead in Silent Hill, after he's done tormenting James Sunderland. The DVD adapted version changes him around a bit, and makes him more of a general tormentor, non-specific to James, which I think is fine. At least they gave some explanation and didn't just ignore it completely. Okay, onto the dull tier. Doctor's base lore is not too interesting and reads like a summary. Interesting concept and good groundwork is set up in this lore, establishing Herman as a twisted doctor that worked for the CIA, recruited to test new methods of using electricity. I wish they maybe lent more into the experimental side of things and expanded on just what made Doctor so effective, or scary. It's rather vague, which contrasts greatly to his tome lore, which is a horrendous read quite frankly. Somewhere in the middle would be good I think. Trapper's lore is fairly straightforward, but at least has a vague structure. This lore is just a product of its time, back when the lore got a lot less focus. It does establish Evan as a person, not much else in terms of his personality. His father Archie gets more development than him I would say. However, I do like the small mystery or just spooky aura to the last few lines of the lore that talk about Archie being found in the warehouse's basement. Hillbilly's lore is very lacking, but I think there's still a clear idea and direction for it. And although it's fairly shallow looking purely at the base lore, it has plenty of groundwork for what it later becomes with his tome lore. I think the main thing they aimed to establish with Billy's lore was his rage and anger, how his parents mistreated him, and how it resulted in the slaughtering of everything on the farm. And hey, they did that. Hag's lore is kinda It sets up a fairly interesting idea, but the lore itself is too short for it to really go anywhere significant. There's some brief reference of the hexes and Lisa's interest in them. I think the main issue with this backstory is that Lisa prior to her capture isn't developed nearly enough. We have no sense really for who she is. However, I do like the idea of her growing up in this quiet, secluded village, which has this strange magical presence and such. That's just a really cool setting. When she is captured, it's a pretty horrific read to be honest, but this is a horror game at the end of the day. I'm personally not too much of a fan of the overly graphic stuff though. Overall, I quite like her base story, if not just for the setting. If we were including her tome lore, well, we don't talk about Hag's tome lore. Race lore is quite boring. Again, this is a situation of him being from the base game when lore didn't matter as much. The core idea of the story is kinda interesting. The idea of him going to work, operating a crusher, only to discover that he's been killing people this whole time is something, but that's basically it. From the base lore alone, we don't know anything about his past, aside minimal reference, and so his character is very unclear. It's an interesting idea though. Let's move on to the fine tier. Leatherface's lore has a small recap of the events events of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but has most of its focus on the emotions and reactions Bubba has to his family being arrested and taken away from him, or at least the thought of it. He becomes scared he'll die without his family. Soon after, he is taken by the entity. The lore is set out like a big panicked stream of consciousness, as Bubba worries about his family and now his new master, the entity. It's kinda cool and is a nice, different but fitting approach for a licensed character. Nurse's base lore is a decent backstory all in all. We're introduced to Sally, a character whose life is going fairly well until her husband dies, and it's turned around completely. Despite this lore being fairly short, it does a decent job at showing Sally's full insanity. The whole purification thing is not very well developed and is made worse in her tome lore. The lore is quite creepy though, and a fairly interesting backstory despite her being one of the earlier characters. Freddy's lore is a unique case of a licensed character having a bit more than just a recap paragraph. The first part is just a recap, which is fine, but then it shifts into the events that I think at least are happening after the events of the 2010 film. It's pretty interesting therefore that we get a development to his story and continuation from the film, which, let's be honest, isn't getting a sequel. It's got some cool description of an encounter between Freddy and Quentin, and tries to lean more into a rivalry between them, shifting away from the character of Nancy. It ends off with some cool interaction with the entity. Not bad license lore. Artist lore is... I think they saw that people liked Spirit's lore and they decided to basically do it again. In order to justify it though, it needed to be twice as tragic, and it ends up being just a bit too much. She has every tragedy possible happen to her, it seems. It doesn't make her compelling, I think, it just makes me miserable reading it. Clown's base lore is kinda boring in my opinion. I think the way that he's developed and set up to be a killer is fairly straightforward and goes down a route of a typical killer's backstory. He has a rough upbringing, a father who hates him, and he gets enjoyment from killing animals. Then he kills someone, cuts off their finger, runs away from home, steals a clown costume, and kills more people. I do like that there is consistency with his sloppiness though, and mention of him nearly getting caught and having to flee. At the very least, although I think Clown is quite generic, he does have a clear beginning, middle, and end to his story, and I think it's also pretty well written. Just not my thing personally. Okay, on to the good tier. Pig's lore is partly recap, however it's redeemed in my eyes for the emotion it reveals, and the thoughts Amanda is having as she dies essentially. The pain, the confusion, the anger, and then a calmness as she arrives in the realm. I actually really like this Saw chapter for this in general. You get some harrowing insight into these people's last moments, and it feels very tonally fitting for DBD. It doesn't really expand on Saw, but it's a unique way of giving insight without really changing or expanding on the events of Saw too much. Again, not bad for licensed lore. Huntress has a cool core to her story, but not much development. It starts out well, but then there just isn't really a story after that. It just kind of stays in the same place, treading water. Most of her lore is just along the lines of Anna was out in the woods and then she killed some guys and took a child. Like, that's broadly it. Its redeeming qualities are that the idea of Anna attempting to be a mother herself, by taking children but failing to take care of them, leaving them to starve, is super tragic, and a really interesting core for a story. Again though, that's the issue I think. That's all the story really is. It doesn't really develop, and it's also not explicitly clear why she doesn't know that humans require food, especially seeing as she herself is one. Trickster's lore has a cool idea at the core, but it's kinda boring. This seems to be a common trend to be honest. Cool idea, but nothing really happens with it. I do think the aspect of him using the screams to create music is fairly inventive, and having this twisted search for the perfect sounds. In some ways, it's hard to judge this lore alone, as Yunjin's comes hand in hand with it in a sense. I personally think it's worth reading, partly just for the very different setting and tone. It's modern day, not like in the 1940s to 1980s, as it is for most of the other characters. Again, it's a change of pace at the very least. Legion's lore is actually kind of good, it's just that it doesn't really go anywhere. When I read their lore, I get no feeling beyond my initial impressions. The Legion members' personalities are all very similar, and also they don't really develop as people, like at all. One thing I really want to see more in the lore is dialogue, as dialogue, or quotations really, are typically restricted to just cosmetic flavor text. Interesting setting, premise is okay and makes sense, but them as individuals and also as a collective honestly, is very underdeveloped. With all this said, I would recommend recommend reading it, as it's a pretty unique lore entry. Spirit's lore is pretty good. I like the idea of having a killer who basically doesn't deserve it and whose story you actually entirely sympathize with, despite her chasing you around in game. I kinda wish there would have been more of a build up to her father's snap. Maybe the lore could have even taken on the perspective of Rin's father initially, so then we can read what the entity whispered and how it manipulated. I feel there needed to be more emphasis on the Yamaoka legacy itself too, and just why it was so important. Overall, I think Rin as a regular person in many ways also makes her easy to sympathize with. Equally, a rather sympathetic character like this really does just need to be a one-off in my opinion. Spirit's lore is definitely worth reading though. Ghostface has a really cool bit of lore, made even better by the fact that he's technically a license. His lore is laid out like a newspaper article for the first half, which is a nice change of presentation. It documents the Ghostface and the Roseville murders, combining quotations and accounts of Jed Olsen before he was found to be the Ghostface. It then cuts back into the typical lore style, with Ghostface reading the article himself, ready to move on. This lore is really cool. It's nice to just get a slight variation in format and perspective, whilst also playing up to the character and their personality. This is one of my personal favorites. Okay, onto the Great Tier. Twins lore took a very different route. If they weren't a killer in game, I could see someone possibly reading it and thinking it's a survivor's lore entry. I don't know, maybe not. Their story is very tragic and has this extremely heartbreaking opening, honestly. Set in the 17th century, the twins struggle to survive as they are hunted down. This lore is really great and well worth reading. I like the inclusion of the small insight into the Black Veil. I find it's nice when there's entity-related parts to characters' lore. It feels like it really grounds them within the Dead by Daylight multiverse. And both the characters of Charlotte and Victor are very compelling. Oni's lore is pretty amazing. Kazan as a character is fairly simple at face value, but has more depth when you look more into his reactions and interactions. I think some people read his lore initially and just think it's about a big angry man getting angry, which, sure, it partly is, but there's a lot more to get out of it, and it's well worth reading. The setting is great, the premise is clearly established and set up, and Kazan is a good character, torn by his desire to maintain his family's legacy. Deathslinger has pretty great lore. This is one of my personal favorites, and a character that I really like, as the story just has a good flow, and feels like one of the few that has a proper beginning, middle, and end. Everything feels wrapped up and satisfying, and it all makes sense and fits together well. It's also got a really cool setting. The side characters like Bayshore, the Warden, and Caleb's gang also get decent characterization, despite being featured in just a few lines. I don't want to say too much about these ones specifically, as I think they're well worth reading yourself. Plague's lore is really great and has a very interesting setting of ancient Babylon. It takes a much more passive approach, unlike a lot of the other lore entries that are just straight into the action. It puts in the work to develop Adiris as a character. Again, nice beginning, middle, and end. It's a proper story. Adiris is very compelling, and the idea of her believing the entity and its whispers are her god is a really cool idea. Very well done. Okay, and finally we have Blight's lore. I like Blight's lore a lot, and I think it's got some really cool elements. This one I know is going to be a little 50-50. I'm pretty sure some people love it, some people hate it. It's that kind of one. I think Blight works so well because he was made for DBD, appearing in the lore a year prior to his release. He's literally like a lore character. Blight's lore includes the kind of stuff I personally enjoy about the lore. It's got a clear structure, established Talbot clearly, and it has a focus on the magical side of things, with ties to the entity and the realm. I would highly recommend reading his lore, but mainly just his base lore, as I feel some of the other entries can kind of confuse things. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and be sure to drop your own favourite backstories down below. Thanks, and goodbye.